Hello, my name is Amanda Hope Haley, and I am the red-haired archaeologist. Thank you so much for spending some of your valuable time today getting to know me and previewing future episodes about ancient dirt and dusty finds and what they can teach us about the biblical world. Biblical archaeology is my passion, and as you listen to this podcast, I hope it will start to excite you too. Last episode, we ended by talking about a place called Tel Dan. It's an archaeological site in the north of the modern state of Israel, and it's really close to the Syrian border. Today, I'm actually going to take you a little bit further north from there. We're going to go into Syria, figuratively, obviously. We're going to visit a place called Ain Dara. It may surprise you to know that this site in Syria is actually what teaches us the most about Solomon's temple, the first temple that he built. So Solomon was King David's son. We talked a lot about King David last episode. And King David brought the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem, but the building of the temple was left to his son Solomon. In 1 Kings, especially chapter 6, the building of the temple is described. It took about 7 years to do. It was built of stone, and inside there were panels of wood that were overlaid in gold and then carved all over the place with cherubim and flowers and fruits. It would have been an incredibly impressive building. What may have been even more impressive is that the construction was relatively silent. I know I live on a busy street in a city that is up and coming, and there are cranes all over our skyline. Construction is never silent. But King Solomon, it says in the text, had all of the people who worked in the quarries cut the stones for the temple and polish them up and have them delivered to Jerusalem ready to set in place. None of that loud construction work actually happened in the city of Jerusalem. The Bible spends a lot of time telling us what that temple looked like. It describes the size of it. It describes colors, the types of metal and wood that are used. It's a pretty thorough description, but if you compare the translations of several different Bibles, you're probably going to see that they read differently. This is because a lot of the words that are used to describe the temple building aren't used other places in the Bible, or they're just extremely rare, so we can't be absolutely certain of exactly what they mean. We can't go to where the temple was and excavate there because excavation is prohibited at the Temple Mount site. Nothing original can be found from it. We can't just go directly to the source and see what we can uncover there. The Wailing Wall, where modern Jews often go to pray, they'll write prayers on little slips of paper and slide them in between the stones that are there. That wall was not Solomon's temple. It would have been part of Herod's temple that was built several hundred years after Solomon's temple was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. My final project for one of my undergraduate classes was to replicate the temple. I was supposed to build something to scale, obviously a much smaller scale, and basically present what I thought the temple looked like based on the words that are used there. It was at that point that I realized the translations do not agree with one another. And even when they do, they're hard to understand. For instance, everything is built in cubits. And to the modern reader of the Bible, a cubit doesn't really mean anything. One of the parts that really confused me was when the lintels and doorposts are being described in 2 Kings. The New King James Version translates it as the lintel and doorposts were 1/5 of the wall. The Voice, which is the translation project that I worked on, we translated it as a lintel and 5-sided doorposts for the entryway in the inner sanctuary. Between two translations, both of which were produced by Thomas Nelson, they both had the same publisher. They were done about 20 years apart from each other. You have in the first, doorposts were 1/5 of the wall, and in the other, 5-sided doorposts. Those mean drastically different things. And actually, both of them are really hard to imagine. They don't really make sense. Since the words aren't clear, a lot of Bibles will include, especially if it's like a study Bible, they'll include an artist rendering of the temple. That can be really helpful And actually, if you'll go to the website, the redhairedarchaeologist.com, I'm going to post some artists' renderings of Solomon's temple, so you can take a look at that there. By the way, archaeologist is ARCHAEOLOGIST. It's an AE in the middle there instead of just an E. Don't ask me why. Since the Bible is confusing and translations don't help, and we can't go back to the original site of Solomon's temple to hopefully uncover some things that would give us details, we turn to biblical archaeology. This is where Ain Dara comes in. This temple is in northwestern Syria. The Ain Dara temple is the best preserved example of what scholars call Syro-Hittite religious architecture. The temple was built in the late 2nd and early 1st millennia BC. It would have been contemporary with Solomon's. It was there right at the same time. It is elaborately decorated. It was built with basalt, but then it was inscribed everywhere with reliefs of cherubim and fruit and flowers, all of that stuff. One thing that really differentiates it from the description we have of Solomon's temple is in front of it, there are these larger than life human footprints that are carved into the thresholds. They are unique to this building. They haven't been found anywhere else. These human footprints are so large that they would have accommodated a god who would have been about 65 feet tall. I hear myself saying that Ain Dara is the most like Solomon's temple. I describe it in the present tense, but I'm actually wrong when I do that. In January of 2018, because of the civil war that's going on in Syria, the temple at Ain Dara was actually bombed. It was hit twice, at least, with precision weapons, and it took out the 2 areas of the temple that had those godlike footprints on them. The explosions took out the walls, the floors, the decorations, the entrance portico, the southern facade of the building. It was basically left as rubble. When news of this got out, some intergovernmental agencies got together to research what had happened. And it was determined that the Turkish Air Force deliberately hit the temple at Ain Dara. They could tell that because of the types of weapons that were used, the types of planes that were in the sky that day, and it was obvious that this was a targeted attack. It wasn't just an instance of accidental carpet bombing or anything like that. They intended to hit the temple at Ain Dara. This to me is heartbreaking. They definitely did it, but we don't know why. The people who researched this event were not able to determine why the Turkish Air Force hit the site. It could have been that it was deliberate and they were trying to take out some evidence of history, or it could have been that the people that they were targeting had holed up here in this archaeological site in hopes of not being attacked. We know it was deliberate, but we don't know the reasons behind it. If you'll go to my website, I'm going to post some links there to the news articles so that you can see the pictures of Ain Dara before and after and read the report on what actually happened. Thanks to the temple at Ain Dara and all of the years of work that were done prior to the Syrian war, we have a much better idea of what some of those obscure Hebrew words are describing. Let's take a minute and compare how Ain Dara is like the description of King Solomon's temple. It was originally built around 1300 BC, and it remained in use for about 550 years until 740 BC. Based on those dates, it would have been built a couple hundred years before Solomon built his temple, and it would have continued to be in use throughout the entire lifetime of the Northern Kingdom. The floor plan of the building is really similar to what the Bible describes. Both buildings are called tripartite, which basically means they are long and slender, and they have 3 rooms inside of them. Both also have similar decorations. The temple gives us physical examples of what we read about in the Bible. We see the cherubim. We see how they're carved there. We see the different fruits. We see the different flowers. We get to see some of that strange sounding architecture that the Bible describes. So we know that the doorposts had 5 sides and not that the doorposts took up 1/5 of the wall. That's super helpful. Just because this temple looks a lot like what the Bible seems to describe, and just because it predated Solomon's temple by 200 or 300 years, that doesn't mean that Solomon took a little trip up there, stole the blueprints, went back to Jerusalem, and had them copy it. That's not what happened at all. The Bible, for one, says that God gave him the plans for the building. The Bible tells us that Phoenician craftsmen were involved in the creation of the temple. Those craftsmen were probably really familiar with the way the Ain Dara and temples like it had been built in the past. So they brought those skills with them when they came and they started building in Israel. But the temples are not identical. Think about it this way. In the early 1900s, a lot of houses were being built in the US that we now call craftsman style. Just in my neighborhood alone, you look around and you can see houses that are similar to each other. Odds are they had the exact same contractors. Maybe they started from the same blueprints. But ultimately, those houses were a popular style, but when they were actually built, they were built for the people who were going to be owning them. They all would have had little differences, be it the color of the wood floors or how high the ceilings are, anything like that that would have been designed for the people who would be living there. I think that's what you see when you compare Ain Dara and the description of Solomon's temple. The temple at Ain Dara had those huge footprints of their god. They pictured a 65-foot god being worshipped there. Solomon's temple did not have that. What Solomon's temple did have was a unique throne for God. God's throne was created by 2 giant cherubim whose wings were extended, and they had a 17-foot wingspan. The Israelites would have pictured their God sitting on a throne 16 feet wide. Israel's God was larger than life. The God worshipped at the Ain Dara temple was larger than life, but they were distinct. The war in Syria and the destruction of Ain Dara are just proof of how tumultuous politics are in the Middle East. As it is right now, there is no way to excavate the Temple Mount and to look for evidence of Solomon's temple. But that could change. I never thought that I would be saying that the temple at Ain Dara was gone, but it is. I am so thankful for the hundreds of years of archaeologists who have spent time excavating places all over the ancient Near East, trying to learn more about the communities who were there and simultaneously learn more about the Bible. When I go to Israel this summer, I'm really looking forward to going to some of these archaeological sites that are no longer active. A lot of them have been turned into parks. Some are maintained by the Israel Antiquities Authority in their national park systems. I think Israel does a really good job of preserving the history that's in the dirt, not just of the Jewish cultures, but of all the cultures that are there. And I hope that's something that never changes. If you enjoyed this episode of The Red-Haired Archaeologist, then I hope you will listen again soon. New episodes will be released each Friday. To learn more about me, check out my website, amandahopehaley.com. There you will find links to my books, this podcast, and my blog, where you can interact with me and other listeners.